The CEO laughed so loudly that the entire boardroom went silent before joining him. His eyes stayed fixed on my wrist. "Seriously?" he said, barely holding back another laugh. "You're wearing that to a board meeting?" A few executives turned to look. Someone chuckled. Another shook his head. The CEO's son leaned back in his leather chair, flashing the polished silver Rolex on his own wrist. "I've seen better watches in the clearance bin at Walmart." More laughter. I looked down at the old watch I'd worn almost every day for over 30 years. The crystal was scratched, the leather strap had been replaced twice. The stainless steel case had lost most of its shine years ago. It wasn't fashionable, it wasn't expensive, it simply kept perfect time. I smiled politely. "I like this one." That only made him laugh harder. "I bet you do." 5 minutes later, the chairman walked into the room. He took 3 steps toward the head of the table, stopped, looked directly at my wrist, and asked one question that changed the rest of my life. "Where did you get that watch?" My name is Daniel Carter. I'm 48 years old, and until that day, nobody outside the manufacturing floor knew my name. I wasn't an executive. I wasn't a director. I wasn't even a manager anymore. Officially, I was the senior facilities supervisor at Ashton Manufacturing, a company that built commercial kitchen equipment across the Midwest. I'd spent 26 years there. I started sweeping metal shavings off concrete floors when I was 22. Back then, the company had only one factory and fewer than 300 employees. Over the years, I learned every machine in the building, every pipe, every electrical panel, every emergency shutdown system. If something broke, people called me. If production stopped at 2 in the morning, I was usually the first one through the door. Most employees knew me. Most executives didn't, and that was perfectly fine with me. I preferred fixing problems over attending meetings. Unfortunately, on that Tuesday morning, I had no choice. The company was preparing for the biggest acquisition in its history. A European manufacturer wanted to purchase a controlling interest in Ashton Manufacturing. Lawyers, consultants, investment bankers, everyone important had flown into Chicago for the negotiations. The board wanted a presentation about upgrading several aging factories before final signatures were exchanged. Normally, someone from operations would handle technical questions in Ashton Manufacturing. Lawyers, consultants, investment bankers, everyone important had flown into Chicago for the negotiations. The board wanted a presentation about upgrading several aging factories before final signatures were exchanged. Normally, someone from operations would handle technical questions, but our operations director had come down with pneumonia 2 days earlier. At 7 that morning, my phone rang. It was the COO. "Daniel, I need you downtown." I thought engineering already finished the report. They did. But if investors ask technical questions, nobody knows those facilities better than you. "I don't exactly own a suit. You don't need one." He paused. "Just come." I probably should have known that was wishful thinking. The moment I stepped into the executive conference room, I realized I didn't belong there. The room looked like something from a magazine. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked downtown Chicago. A polished walnut table stretched nearly 30 feet long. Fresh flowers sat beside imported bottled water. Everyone else wore tailored suits that probably cost more than my pickup truck. I wore dark work slacks, a clean blue button-down shirt, and the only blazer I owned. It was almost 10 years old. Several people nodded politely. Most ignored me. I found an empty chair near the end of the table and quietly organized my notes. That's when he walked in. Ethan Reynolds, the CEO's only son, 31 years old, Harvard MBA, Vice President of Strategic Development, future CEO, at least everyone assumed he would be. He had the confidence that comes from growing up believing every room already belonged to you. Perfect haircut, perfect suit, perfect smile, and absolutely no interest in learning anyone's name unless it appeared on an executive organizational chart. He glanced around the table. Then his eyes landed on me. "You must be." He looked at my visitor badge. "Daniel." I stood and offered my hand. He barely looked at it. "You work in maintenance, right?" "Facilities." "Close enough." He sat down across from me. As he adjusted his cufflinks, the lights reflected off the bright blue face of his Rolex. Several executives complimented it. He happily explained that it was a limited edition his father had given him after business school. Everyone admired it. I returned to reviewing my paperwork. I honestly didn't care what another man wore on his wrist. Apparently, he cared very much about what was on mine. About 10 minutes before the meeting started, I reached for my coffee. My sleeve slid back. That was all it took. Ethan noticed the watch immediately. He leaned forward. "Hold on." His voice echoed through the room. "Is that actually your watch?" I looked down. "Yes." He stared at it as if I'd placed a rusty wrench on the conference table. "That thing has to be older than I am." A couple of people laughed. "It probably is." He smiled. "You know," he tapped his Rolex. "They do make new watches now." More laughter. I shrugged. "This one still works." "Oh, I'm sure it tells time." He grinned at the others. "But my grandfather had one that looked exactly like that." Someone farther down the table added, "I think my dad keeps one like it in his garage." Another executive laughed. "I've seen better watches at garage sales." The room filled with quiet chuckles. Nobody said anything cruel enough to sound malicious. But together, it became something else, the kind of laughter that reminds you exactly where you stand. Ethan wasn't finished. "You know what?" He smiled. "I'll tell HR to increase the maintenance budget." He pointed toward my wrist, "so they can finally buy you a watch made in this century." Several people laughed again. I simply took a sip of coffee. "I appreciate the concern." He seemed disappointed that I wasn't embarrassed. "So, sentimental value?" I nodded once. "You could say that." He smirked. I figured. He leaned back confidently, convinced he'd won some invisible contest. I didn't argue. Some things aren't worth explaining, especially to people who have already decided they know the answer. The room settled as assistants distributed printed agendas. The conversation shifted toward quarterly earnings, acquisition numbers, factory expansions. No one looked at my watch again. At least, not until the conference room doors opened. Every person at the table stood. The chairman had arrived. Richard Lawson wasn't in the office very often anymore. At 76, he'd stepped away from daily operations years earlier, leaving most decisions to the CEO. Still, when he entered a room, everyone noticed. He smiled politely as he greeted board members one by one. Then he turned toward my end of the table. He took another step. Suddenly, he stopped walking. His expression changed. Not confusion, not surprise, recognition. His eyes never left my wrist. The room fell completely silent. Even Ethan noticed. The chairman slowly approached me. For several long seconds, nobody spoke. Finally, in a calm voice barely above a whisper, he asked, "Young man." He looked directly at my old watch. "Where did you get that watch?" "From daily operations years earlier, leaving most decisions to the CEO. Still, when he entered a room, everyone noticed. He smiled politely as he greeted board members one by one. Then he turned toward my end of the table. He took another step. Suddenly, he stopped walking. His expression changed. Not confusion, not surprise, recognition. His eyes never left my wrist. The room fell completely silent. Even Ethan noticed. The chairman slowly approached me. For several long seconds, nobody spoke. Finally, in a calm voice barely above a whisper, he asked, "Young man." He looked directly at my old watch. "Where did you get that watch?" He looked directly at my old watch. "Where did you get that watch?" No one even seemed to breathe. Chairman Richard Lawson wasn't looking at me anymore. He was looking at the watch, not casually, not with curiosity, with the kind of focus people reserve for something they never expected to see again. I glanced around the room. Even the CEO looked confused. "Dad?" he asked carefully. "Is everything all right?" The chairman didn't answer. Instead, he took one slow step closer to me. "Daniel." His voice was softer now. "Would you mind if I looked at it?" I unbuckled the worn leather strap and placed the watch gently into his waiting hand. The room was so quiet I could hear the air conditioner humming overhead. Richard held it with both hands. Not like an old watch, like an old photograph. His thumb slowly traced the scratches across the crystal. Then he turned it over. He studied the back for several seconds. His fingers paused near one corner of the case. Almost unconsciously, he smiled. Not a broad smile, a quiet one. Almost unconsciously, he smiled. Not a broad smile, a quiet one, the kind that appears when a memory returns after years of hiding. Finally, he looked back at me. "It still keeps perfect time?" I nodded. "Within a few seconds every month." His smile grew just a little. I thought it would. Nobody in the room understood what was happening. Least of all Ethan. He let out a small laugh. I guess they really don't make them like they used to. A few executives smiled politely, unsure whether they were supposed to laugh. Richard didn't react. He carefully handed the watch back to me. Thank you. That was it. No explanation, no story, no dramatic announcement. He simply walked to the head of the table and opened the meeting. For the next 2 hours, everyone discussed numbers, revenue projections, supply chain risks, factory modernization, European investors, debt restructuring. Questions flew across the table. I answered every technical question directed toward me. How long would Building 3 remain operational? Which production lines needed replacing? How much downtime would installation require? I answered calmly. 26 years inside those factories had taught me every bolt and every breaker panel. Several board members nodded as they took notes. One investor even thanked me for explaining the maintenance costs in plain English instead of engineering jargon. But every few minutes, I caught Chairman Lawson looking toward my wrist. Never for long, just long enough for me to notice. Then he'd quietly return to the meeting. Each time, his expression looked a little different, as though pieces of a puzzle were slowly fitting together. Ethan noticed it too. Unfortunately, he misunderstood what it meant. During a short coffee break, people gathered in small groups around the conference room. I was pouring myself another cup when Ethan walked over. He smiled in the confident way people smile when they're certain they're the smartest person in the room. So, he glanced toward the chairman. Looks like your antique impressed him. I wouldn't know. You should ask him to put it in the company museum. A couple of younger executives standing nearby laughed. It might actually belong there. I smiled politely. It still tells time. Ethan shook his head. You really love saying that. I only answer the questions I'm asked. He laughed. I'll give you credit. For what? You don't seem embarrassed. I looked him in the eye. Why would I be? He shrugged. I don't know. He looked down at his Rolex. If I were wearing something that old to an executive meeting. He let the sentence hang. I'd probably leave it in the car. I took another sip of coffee. Good thing it's your wrist. The younger executives exchanged quick glances. One of them tried not to smile. Ethan noticed. His own smile faded for the first time that morning. Before he could respond, someone announced that the meeting was restarting. The afternoon session focused on future leadership. That was Ethan's favorite topic. He gave a polished presentation about digital transformation, artificial intelligence, market expansion, international branding. He spoke confidently, smoothly. Every slide looked perfect. When he finished, several board members applauded. He looked satisfied. Then one investor raised a simple question. How will these changes affect your oldest manufacturing plants? Ethan hesitated. He clicked backward through his slides. None of them answered the question. He tried speaking in general terms. Operational efficiencies, strategic restructuring, long-term optimization. The investor interrupted. I'm asking specifically about Plant 4. Silence. Ethan looked toward operations. No one answered. Finally, the CEO looked at me. Daniel, I opened my folder. Plant 4 was built in 1989. It still has 2 original stamping lines. They're reliable but reaching end of life. We can modernize without shutting production completely. I explained exactly how. Estimated costs, timeline, labor requirements, safety concerns, everything. The investor nodded. That's the answer I was looking for. Several people wrote notes. Across the table, Ethan quietly closed his laptop. The meeting continued another hour. When it finally ended, executives began gathering their papers. People shook hands. Investors thanked everyone for their time. I packed my binder and prepared to leave. I figured I'd be back repairing conveyor belts before sunset, just the way I preferred it. Then I heard the chairman's voice. Daniel. I turned. If you have a few minutes? He paused. I'd appreciate speaking with you privately. Every conversation in the room stopped. Several executives looked up. The CEO blinked. Even he seemed surprised. Of course, I said. Richard nodded toward the hallway. This way. He walked out first. I followed. Behind me, I could almost feel everyone's eyes, especially Ethan's. The chairman's office occupied the entire corner of the top floor. I'd never been inside. The walls displayed photographs dating back nearly 50 years. Factory groundbreakings, award ceremonies, pictures of employees whose names I didn't recognize. Richard closed the heavy wooden door behind us. For a moment, neither of us spoke. He walked to his desk. then slowly turned toward me. His eyes drifted back to the watch. Would you mind? He hesitated. If I saw it once more? Without a word, I removed it and handed it over again. This time, he didn't examine the front. He turned it over immediately. His thumb rested on the worn steel back, almost exactly where it had during the meeting. His breathing slowed. I haven't seen one of these, he swallowed, in 34 years. A strange feeling settled in my stomach. You've seen one, he looked up. His eyes were no longer studying the watch. They were studying me, very carefully, as if trying to recognize someone whose face had been buried beneath decades of time. Then he quietly asked a question I never expected to hear. Daniel, were you working at the old Riverside plant, the night of the fire? Again. This time, he didn't examine the front. He turned it over immediately. His thumb rested on the worn steel back, almost exactly where it had during the meeting. His breathing slowed. I haven't seen one of these, he swallowed, in 34 years. A strange feeling settled in my stomach. You've seen one, he looked up. His eyes were no longer studying the watch. They were studying me, very carefully, as if trying to recognize someone whose face had been buried beneath decades of time. Then he quietly asked a question I never expected to hear. Daniel, were you working at the old Riverside plant, the night of the fire? Were you working at the old Riverside plant, the night of the fire? For a moment, answer. The old Riverside plant. I hadn't heard those 3 words spoken aloud in years. Most people at Ashton Manufacturing didn't even know there had been another factory before the current headquarters. It had been demolished decades ago after a series of expansions. The newer employees assumed the company had always looked the way it did today. Only a handful of people still remembered Riverside, and even fewer remembered what happened there. I looked at Chairman Lawson. Yes, I finally said. I was there. His shoulders lowered ever so slightly as if he'd been carrying a weight for decades. I thought so. Silence settled over the office. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, downtown Chicago moved as if nothing unusual was happening. Cars crawled through traffic, people hurried along the sidewalks. Inside that office, time seemed to stop. Richard looked down at the watch again. When I saw it, he said quietly, I told myself it couldn't be. He looked back at me, but then I noticed the scratches. I smiled faintly. It hasn't had an easy life. No. He shook his head. Neither have you. I sat across from his desk. For the first time that day, I felt nervous. Not because I thought I was in trouble, because I wasn't sure where this conversation was going. Richard carefully placed the watch on a leather pad in front of him. You've never told anyone a question? No. Not even your supervisors? No. The CEO? I smiled. He wasn't even working here then. Richard gave a slow nod. I suppose not. He leaned back in his chair. I've wondered about you. That surprised me. You wondered about me? For years. I frowned. I don't understand. I'll explain. He paused. But first, his expression became serious. I need to ask you something. Of course. Why did you keep wearing this watch? I looked at it. The worn leather, the faded dial, the tiny scratch running across the crystal. The same scratch Ethan had laughed at. It reminds me, I answered. Of what? Who I wanted to be. Richard didn't say anything. He simply nodded, as though that answer made perfect sense. A knock interrupted us. The door opened slightly. It was Linda, the chairman's executive assistant. Mr. Lawson? She hesitated. The investors are waiting downstairs. I'll be there shortly. She nodded and closed the door. Before it shut completely, I noticed something. Standing several feet down the hallway. Ethan. He wasn't talking to anyone. He wasn't looking at his phone. He was pretending to study a painting on the wall. But every few seconds, his eyes drifted toward the chairman's office. Richard noticed him too. Without saying a word, he walked over and quietly closed the door the rest of the way. Then he locked it. I raised an eyebrow. You think someone was listening? He gave a tired smile. I've spent 50 years in business. I assume someone is always listening. He returned to his desk. I'd like you to tell me something. What? What do you remember about that night? I let out a slow breath. I remember too much. The memories came back faster than I expected. The smell first, burning insulation, hot steel, machine oil, then the alarms, people running, someone shouting, emergency lights flashing through thick smoke. I was 23. My shift was almost over. I remember hearing what sounded like an explosion. Richard didn't interrupt. The stamping department lost power. One of the hydraulic lines ruptured. There was fire everywhere. I stared past him, not at the office, at a place I'd spent years trying to forget. Everyone started evacuating. I helped 2 operators get outside. I thought that was everyone. Richard slowly folded his hands, but it wasn't. I shook my head. No. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Finally, Richard asked quietly, "Do you remember who told you I was still inside?" I frowned. "No. I've tried to remember. I never could." "It doesn't matter." He looked out the window. "What matters is that everyone else was already outside. I remembered that much. Firefighters hadn't arrived yet. Smoke poured from broken windows. People were yelling. Someone kept shouting your name. Back then, Richard Lawson wasn't the chairman. He was simply the company's founder. A man who still walked the production floor every morning, who knew welders by name, who ate lunch in the same cafeteria as everyone else. I remembered hearing someone scream, 'Richard's still in there.' Then, without thinking, I'd run back inside. I rubbed my forehead. I remember finding you. Richard's eyes never left mine. You were trapped. There'd been a partial collapse. You couldn't move. His voice remained calm. And then? I don't remember much after that. That's interesting. Why? Because I do. That caught me off guard. You do? Every second. He leaned forward. I remember thinking that I was going to die. His voice was barely above a whisper. I remember hearing the roof groaning. I remember breathing smoke. I remember trying to free my leg. And then, he smiled sadly, I heard someone shouting. I swallowed. I don't remember shouting. You were. He laughed quietly. You kept yelling, "Don't you dare quit on me." I stared at him. I said that over and over. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. It felt strange hearing someone describe a version of myself I barely remembered. Another knock came at the door. This one louder. "Mr. Lawson?" It was the CEO. "Dad, the investors really need us." Richard looked toward the door. "I'll be there in a minute." Footsteps faded away. He waited until they disappeared, then turned back toward me. "Daniel, I need you to understand something. The people outside that room think this is about an old watch. It isn't." I nodded slowly. I figured. The watch is only proof. Proof of what? He looked directly into my eyes. That I've finally found the man I've been trying to thank for 34 years. I opened my mouth to answer. Nothing came out. Because none of this felt real. I hadn't saved anyone expecting recognition. I hadn't stayed at Ashton because I thought it would eventually pay off. I'd simply gone back to work after I recovered. Life moved on. People retired. Managers came and went. The company grew. Years passed. The fire became another story locked away in old newspaper archives. At least, that's what I believed. Richard opened the top drawer of his desk. Carefully, he removed a faded black and white photograph. He placed it between us. It showed the original Riverside factory. Dozens of employees stood outside after the building opened. Most of the faces were too small to recognize. Except one, near the back. A young man in grease-stained coveralls, wearing a familiar watch. Richard tapped the photograph gently, then looked back at me. "I've kept this picture in my desk for over 3 decades. His voice cracked for the first time. "Because I never learned the name of the young man who walked back into a burning building." He paused, taking a slow breath, "to save my life. Save my life." Neither of us. I kept staring at the photograph. The young man in the back barely looked like me. His hair was darker, his shoulders were broader, his face carried the quiet confidence of someone who believed life was just beginning. He had no idea what was waiting for him. Or that, 34 years later, an old photograph would bring him back into the same room with the man he'd once pulled from a burning factory. Richard broke the silence first. "I searched for you." I looked up. "You searched for me?" He nodded. "For months. I offered rewards. I asked supervisors. I interviewed every firefighter who responded that night." I frowned. "I never heard any of that." "You couldn't." "Why not?" "Because you weren't here." The memories slowly returned. After the fire, I'd spent nearly 3 weeks in the hospital, smoke inhalation, burns on my arms, a fractured shoulder from falling debris. The doctors insisted I stay home for months afterward. By the time I returned, the Riverside accepted severance packages, departments were reorganized, managers retired, the company moved forward, like companies always do. I was transferred to Plant 4, I said quietly. Nobody really talked about the fire anymore. Richard nodded. I know. I came looking for you. But every record simply said, he smiled sadly, transferred. He leaned back in his chair. There were over 400 Daniels working for Ashton over the following decade. I interviewed 6 of them. I couldn't help smiling. You found the wrong Daniels. Repeatedly. We both laughed. It was the first genuine laugh either of us had shared all afternoon. Then his expression grew serious again. I never found the right one. He picked up my watch once more. This wasn't your watch originally. It wasn't a question. No. Whose was it? My father's. Richard looked surprised. I thought so. My dad worked maintenance before I did. He wore this every day. When he passed away, I kept it. Richard turned the watch over again. But something about it changed, I nodded. I replaced the movement. His eyebrows lifted. You know watches? Not really. I just learned enough to keep this one running. I hesitated. After everything happened, I promised myself I wouldn't let it stop. Richard looked thoughtful. The watch? No, my father's example. He slowly handed it back. You know, I've been trying to repay a debt for 34 years. I smiled. There isn't one. He looked almost offended. There absolutely is. You saved my life. I did what anyone would have done. He shook his head immediately. No, they didn't. The words hung in the air. They ran. You came back. I looked away. I never blamed them. Neither do I. He folded his hands together. But facts are facts. If you hadn't returned... He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. A few moments later, he stood. Come with me. Where? Back downstairs. I hesitated. The meeting's over. He smiled. I know. This isn't about the meeting. As we walked through the executive hallway, people stepped aside, not because of me, because of him. Employees greeted the chairman respectfully. Many glanced curiously in my direction. Word had already spread that I'd spent nearly an hour alone in his office. Nobody knew why. When the elevator doors opened, Richard surprised me again. Instead of pressing the lobby button, he selected the executive dining floor. The investors are there. So are the board members. I looked at him. I don't think I belong in that room. He smiled. That's exactly the problem. The private dining room overlooked Lake Michigan. Round tables filled the room. Executives, investors, attorneys, board members. The CEO was standing near the windows, speaking with 2 European representatives. Ethan stood beside him, laughing confidently as though the awkward moment from earlier had never happened. The room quieted as Richard entered. Everyone expected him to begin discussing the acquisition. Instead, he walked straight toward me. Daniel, he spoke loudly enough for everyone to hear. Would you stand beside me? Every conversation stopped. Forks rested on plates, glasses lowered, even the waitstaff paused. Richard looked around the room. I owe everyone here an apology. Several people exchanged confused looks. I should have introduced our most important employee much sooner. The CEO blinked. I'm sorry? Richard continued. Many of you have spent today's meeting discussing the future of Ashton Manufacturing. He smiled gently. But before we talk about the future, you deserve to know something about its past. I felt every eye in the room settle on me, including Ethan's. His confident smile slowly disappeared. Richard held up my old watch. This morning, he said, several people laughed at this watch. No one moved. No one dared. I don't blame them. It looks old. It looks ordinary. He turned it over carefully. But appearances have a habit of lying. His eyes found Ethan for only a second, not accusing, simply disappointed. Then he looked back at the room. 34 years ago, I became trapped inside our Riverside factory during a catastrophic fire. Several older board members immediately recognized the story. Their expressions changed. I survived for one reason. He paused. One employee ignored every evacuation order. He ran back inside. He found me. He carried me through collapsing steel and burning debris. He nearly died doing it. The room became perfectly still. I spent years trying to find him. I never did. He smiled toward me. Until this morning. The silence that followed felt endless. The CEO looked from me to his father, then back again. You mean? Richard nodded. Yes. Daniel Carter. He is the man who saved my life. No applause, no dramatic gasps, just complete silence. Sometimes, silence says more than any standing ovation ever could. Across the room, Ethan looked as though the floor had disappeared beneath him. His face had lost every trace of confidence. His eyes drifted toward my wrist, toward the watch he'd mocked only hours earlier. Then, slowly, back toward me. For the first time all day, he wasn't seeing an aging maintenance supervisor. He was seeing someone he'd never bothered to know. Richard wasn't finished. He rested a hand gently on my shoulder. Then he said something no one in the room expected. And there's one I barely slept tonight, not because of what the chairman had revealed, because of what he had said just before everyone left. The future of this company. Those words kept replaying in my head. I had spent 26 years avoiding attention. Now, somehow, I had become the center of it. When I pulled into the employee parking lot the next morning, everything felt strangely normal. Forklifts were unloading steel. The first shift was changing over. Someone waved as I walked toward the maintenance shop. Mike, one of the mechanics, handed me a work order. Conveyor in building 2 is acting up. I smiled. Guess I'd better fix it. To me, yesterday had been unusual. Today was just another work day, or so I thought. About 20 minutes later, my phone rang. It was Linda, the chairman's assistant. Mr. Carter? Yes? The board meeting starts in 30 minutes. I think you've got the wrong Daniel. A soft laugh came through the phone. No, sir. I definitely have the right Daniel. The chairman specifically asked me to make sure you arrive wearing your work clothes. My work clothes? Exactly. No suit. No tie. He said, and I quote, I want everyone to remember exactly who built this company. When I entered the executive boardroom again, the atmosphere had completely changed. Yesterday, I had been invisible. Today, every conversation stopped. Several directors stood to shake my hand. The European investors smiled warmly. One of them said, It is an honor to finally meet you. I wasn't sure how to respond. I'm just Daniel. One older board member smiled. That's exactly why we're standing. Only one person remained seated. Ethan. He looked exhausted. The confidence he'd worn like a tailored suit the day before was gone. There was no expensive smile, no jokes, no arrogance, just silence. For the first time, he looked his age. 31. Not ready. Richard Lawson entered a few moments later. He didn't sit immediately. Instead, he stood beside the large windows overlooking the city. I've spent the last 34 years thinking about legacy. He looked around the room. Most people believe legacy is in money. He shook his head. It isn't. And they think it's measured in buildings. It isn't. They think it's measured in titles. It isn't. He turned toward me. Legacy is measured by the people who choose to do the right thing when no one is watching. The room remained silent. I've watched Daniel Carter do exactly that for 26 years. He began walking slowly around the table. He never used his history to ask for promotions. He never demanded recognition. He never reminded anyone that he once saved the founder's life. He simply came to work. Every single day. Richard stopped beside his son, Ethan. His voice was calm. Stand up. Ethan obeyed immediately. Richard looked him in the eyes. Yesterday, you laughed at a watch. Ethan lowered his head. I know. You thought it represented failure. Yes. You judged a man before learning his story. I did. Richard let the silence linger. Then he asked one final question. What do you think that watch was actually worth? Ethan looked at me, then at the old stainless steel watch resting quietly on my wrist. Finally, he answered, I don't think there's enough money to buy it. Richard nodded. Correct. To everyone's surprise, Ethan stepped away from the table. He walked toward me slowly. Every executive watched. He stopped only a few feet away. I'm sorry. His voice wasn't polished anymore. It wasn't rehearsed. It was honest. I mocked you. I assumed I knew everything about you. I assumed. He glanced at the floor. That success looked like expensive things. He swallowed. I've never been more wrong. The room was completely silent. I looked at him for a long moment. Then I smiled. You know something? He looked up. When I was your age, I thought older people didn't understand the future. A few people smiled. It took me years to realize. They already survived the parts I hadn't reached yet. For the first time, Ethan smiled back. A real one. Richard returned to the front of the room. Now, about yesterday's announcement. Everyone straightened in their seats. The board unanimously approved the creation of a new position. A slide appeared on the large screen. Senior Advisor to the Chairman, Employee Culture and Operational Excellence. Several directors nodded. Richard continued. This position reports directly to me. It exists for one reason, so that the values this company was built upon never disappear. Then he looked at me. Daniel Carter, would you accept it? I honestly didn't know what to say. I've never been an executive, Richard smiled. I'm not asking you to become one. I'm asking you to remind them how to be human. That hit me harder than any promotion ever could. After a long pause, I nodded. I'll accept. The room erupted into applause. Not because I'd received a new title, because everyone in that room understood what would never disappear. Then he looked at me. Daniel Carter, would you accept it? I honestly didn't know what to say. I've never been an executive, Richard smiled. I'm not asking you to become one. I'm asking you to remind them how to be human. That hit me harder than any promotion ever could. After a long pause, I nodded. I'll accept. The room erupted into applause. Not because I'd received a new title, because everyone in that room understood what it represented. Over the following months, something unexpected happened. The maintenance shop stayed exactly where it was. I still walked the factory floor every morning. I still carried a flashlight in my pocket. I still stopped to help mechanics troubleshoot broken machines. The only difference, sometimes board members walked beside me. Instead of asking only about profits, they started asking about people. Employee turnover dropped. Safety improved. Ideas from factory workers reached the boardroom faster than ever before. Even Ethan changed. Instead of spending mornings in executive meetings, he began visiting every department. He listened more than he spoke. He learned employees' names. Months later, I caught him eating lunch in the factory cafeteria. Nobody had asked him to. He simply understood that leadership couldn't be inherited. It had to be earned. About a year later, Ethan stopped by my office. He placed a small box on my desk. I saw this and thought of you. Inside was a beautiful modern wristwatch. Swiss made, elegant, far more expensive than anything I would ever buy for myself. I smiled. It's beautiful. But I looked down at the old watch on my wrist. I'm keeping this one. He laughed. I figured. I didn't buy it to replace yours. What then? So you'll have something to give your grandson someday. For a second, neither of us spoke. Then I reached across the desk and shook his hand. This time, he shook mine with both of his. Today, that old watch still loses less than 5 seconds a month. The crystal is still scratched. The leather strap has been replaced again. Most people would never look at it twice. And that's perfectly fine, because every scratch reminds me of a lesson that took a lifetime to understand. People spend far too much time trying to look successful and far too little time becoming someone worth remembering. The CEO's son thought my watch measured time. The chairman knew it measured character. And in the end, character was the only thing anyone still talked about, and far too little time becoming someone worth remembering. The CEO's son thought my watch measured time. The chairman knew it measured character. And in the end, character was the only thing anyone still talked about.